Do a little bit of the history of German, the early history of German, and I'm not really prepared for what I'm doing because I've been so busy at the building I really haven't had a chance to do everything the way I would normally do it. So we'll start with in the beginning. God created heaven and earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. So German was underwater twice, early on, and then when Noah was here. And the reason I know that is because of working with the geologists up at Tunkhannock on the Indians artifacts dig up there when they were putting the bypass in. I had to dig a hole for the geologists, so I had to dig it probably 30 feet by 30 feet square, and then I had to put a ledge in it so they could walk on it about 7 feet wide, and then I had to dig another hole below that and another ledge so they can go down in that, and then all the way down into the bottom. And the young girl who was the geologist, she came up and she was scraping the sides, and she said, this is when this lived here, this is when this lived here, this is when this lived here, and this period here, she said, is the Great Flood. And I was surprised to hear that from a scientist, geologist. And I said, you mean Noah's Great Flood? And she said, yes, there was a great flood that covered the whole world. So we do know that that existed. So German was underwater twice, not the flood that Joni knows. 2003 did not cover the whole town. It just covered her building. So that was the beginning. So when we start with the beginning, we're starting with the fossils that are on this side over here. This fossil here, all of these are local. They all came from this is one of the biggest areas for fossils because of the coal mines. And it's in the slate and it's in the coal in the layers. And there's fern fossils, and these are what they call Lycopods Rootstocks. And this one was told to me by a guy who that's not all he does, that it was 10 million years old.
Oh my gosh.
So these are similar, and this is a tree limb, but I see these every day. I work down in Powell's development down in Archibald where they're digging in top of the slate and where the coal is, and that's you find nothing but fossils down there. I don't know how he gets away with doing it without anybody coming in and inspecting it, but that's this area is very well known for that. And at one point, German was a mile below the top of the ice, from the ice age, from the glacier. Glaciers were a mile deep here, and that's how the pothole was formed by the swirl from the glaciers when they were receding. But there was a mile thick sheet of ice that came down here. It ended up down towards the Delaware River at the Delaware Water Gap, and it went as far south as Berwick. And they found all the big boulders that rolled out of the glacier and rolled down ahead of the glacier, and that's how they know where the stopping points were. And that's what the scientists tell us. So after the beginning, then God said this was good, but he needed firmament. So he separated the waters and created the earth. And then, so on day 2, German was here. Okay, so that's how early we're starting here. And then, let's see, then there were rocks and hills and how's that song go? Rocks and birds and hills and plains, the horse with no name on American. So there was everything you can think of was starting to grow, and that's when we had the trees and flowers and plants and everything was going. And then as the years went on, the topsoil got covered by the leaves and just kept pushing the earth and the pressure, and that's how coal was formed, and that's how these got buried. So then the next part of German's history is the part where we don't know anything about because Indians don't leave records. And there were all kinds of Indians. There was 4 or 5 different eras where the Indians were here, from the Paleo all the way to the historic woodlands. And the historic woodlands are the only Indians we know anything about, because they're the only ones that left any kind of traces that they were here. Now out west there's cave dwelling Indians, and there's everything you can think of out there, because they wrote everything in the caves. And here we don't have that. Now, we do know there were dinosaurs. We don't know if there were dinosaurs walking here, but they found a mammoth down by Stroudsburg. It's in a museum down there. They unearthed one. I think it's going out of Stroudsburg, heading up towards along the Delaware River there. They found a woolly mammoth, and it's, so that there is proof that there were dinosaurs here. No saber-toothed tigers that I know of, but Snagglepuss wasn't here. But the Indians were here, and they traveled. They were nomadic. They traveled. They were hunter-gatherers. They ate berries. They hunted whatever they could. They fished wherever they could. And for generations and generations and generations, they traveled here. Left no word to us that they were here. We don't know. But we do know that the modern Indians were here, the historic Indians. You'll see the book there that tells you what historic periods and what Indians were here. The Lenape Indians, or the Munsee tribe, they were the ones that we know were here. They're the ones that settled in Scranton. They were down in what's called Capoose Meadows, because Chief Capoose was the Indian chief of the Munsee tribe, and it's Capouse instead of Capoose. But there was a big village at the end of the Lackawanna River where it goes into the Susquehanna. It was called Ossurgeny, and they're still digging down there. Dale talked about it a little bit at our last meeting, but they were digging there for probably 20 years. They're still digging and finding Indian artifacts there. The Indians actually asked the English to build a fort there to protect them, because they were sort of set on settling in with the English, but the French wanted to try to turn them against the English during the French and Indian Wars. And then there was a fort a little farther up the Lackawanna. There were two Indian paths that went through here, up through the Lackawanna River, one on the right side of the river, one on the left side of the river, from the mouth of the Lackawanna going into the Susquehanna. And the one path came up as far as Old Forge, and then crossed over the river and met the other path. And then it came up through Scranton, up to where Capouse was, and then it went up into the Gap by going up into Clark Summit there, the South Abington Gap, and it went over by Sickler's Pond. So it's in Greenfield Township. There was a path that went all the way up to New York through, it was called the Lackawanna Path. There were paths that went over this mountain. The Indians used to travel from New York all the way through, straight down through Mount Cobb. They used to set fires up on top of the mountains. They always walked the mountains so that they could see in the valleys if any of the rival Indians were there. A Frenchman named Brulé was the first person to find the Indians in this area. He came out of Canada, came down through the Susquehanna River, and found the Susquehanna Indians, which is where the Susquehanna got its name. They were giants among Indians, according to him. They were huge. They were the largest men that they've seen, and they were very warlike, but they accepted him because he was peaceful and traded with them, and there was only one of him, so he wasn't going to be a threat to them. So he lived to report it back. Now in this area here was settled by the Connecticut. They had a charter from King Charles. It was the Massachusetts Connecticut group, and then it was also settled by William Penn. The charter was given to William Penn for the same land. So back in the 1750s, that's when they started to come here and started to build cabins and live in the woods. The only sign we have of anything, or word we have of anything, was there were some trappers here that walked through and hunted and trapped, and that's all we know of white settlements up in this area. The first real settlements were all down towards Scranton, which was Slocum Hollow at the time, and there were a couple cabins there. They were constantly being attacked by the Indians, and they came here, settled for a year or 2 years, maybe 2 or 3 cabins. A lot of them were killed, their animals were stolen and killed, and then they went back to Massachusetts and Connecticut, and then 4 or 5 years later they got a bigger group of people, came back here again, came the same way down over the Mount Cobb, right to the, where you see it in Dunmore there, where you go through the notch up on the top of that hill there, and then down into Scranton. They settled it again, and then we had all the French and Indian Wars, and they were the Pennamite Wars, and that's when the Wyoming Massacre happened, and General George Washington got real upset and sent General Sullivan to chase them out of here, and that was the last we've seen of the Indians. There's a book over there called Falling Feathers, I think it is. That was written by a lady in the Poconos. If you get a chance to see that, but that's a great book on the Indians. It tells a lot about the Indians in this area. What we know of Indians, you can see here the arrowheads that are here, spear points that are here. These are tools, rubbing tools that are here, tools that they use to start fires. You can see the little round hole. The Indian bowl. These are all things that Jimmy Durst is probably the best here of people that could tell you a little bit about the Indians. He found a lot of artifacts up at up at the White Ledges and the Black Ledges, and at what was then called Skull Pond, which is Chapman Lake. He found a lot of stuff up there. I went up looking and didn't find anything, but I worked for the archaeologist in Tunkhannock for 2.5 years, and they walked across the field and would pick up an arrowhead and bring it back and show me, and I walked every day for an hour for lunch, and all I found was nuts and bolts. So I have no luck finding them, so I've been buying a lot, but my collection is pretty small compared to a lot. I got some from a guy in Tunkhannock and found a couple up in Tunkhannock. There's still a lot of Indian artifacts out there. We just don't know where to look for them. There were Indian furnaces along the Susquehanna River, and this guy that sold me the arrowheads has found them. He won't tell me where they are, but they're up in the rocks along the Susquehanna River, up by falls. So we're getting more and more into now where we're into German, and it's not really German yet. We are Blakely Township. Blakely Township was where we sit right now, and we were part of Carbondale Township. Carbondale Township would have been from the Windsor up, so all of Mayfield would have been Carbondale Township, and everything from the Windsor in German up through Division Street would have been Carbondale Township. So when we learn a little bit about the history of German, the first name that comes to us is named Christopher Wilbur. I wrote all this stuff down, but I should be looking at it, but I'm not going to read it all. So Christopher Wilbur was here his father was born in Carbondale, I believe, and Christopher Wilbur and his father helped the Wirtz brothers find the coal in Carbondale, and that was anywhere from 1804 to the early 1810 in that time period. So that was when the first people that were listed as being here. Christopher Wilbur built a cabin and an inn at the mouth of the Rushbrook Creek, where the Rushbrook Creek goes into the confluence, where the Rushbrook Creek goes into the Lackawanna River. There used to be an Indian path along the river. That was the first road and the first way that people traveled from Blakely, which was, we were part of Blakely Township. Blakely was the closest town. In 1850, there was only 500 people in all of Blakely Township. And Blakely Township went all the way from Blakely, Peckville, Archibald, up into German. So Blakely Township in 1850 only had 500 people, so there weren't very many people in German. So we're talking about the 1830s when Christopher Wilbur was here. And if you went down from the Windsor Instead of going up the Casey Highway, there was none then. It went down to the river, and right there where the path came up along the river, that's where Christopher Wilbur's cabin was, an inn. And there was a record in the paper. I got this from the Dundas Gazette, and they were an early newspaper from the 1820s and 30s. Dundas was actually settled pretty well back then. And it states where Christopher Wilbur was drunk and fell out of a wagon. So he had the inn. He evidently used a lot of his own liquor, so he had a reputation. But he owned 360 acres of land. At that time, there were 3 farms here. There was a farm, one of the famous name now because it's in Mayfield is Depews Avenue. But there was a Depews farm, which was in Carbondale Township, but in the upper right-hand corner of German. There was the Wilbur land, but it wasn't a farm. Well, can't say it wasn't a farm. They called it a farm because he evidently grew what he needed to eat, because back then that's what you did. And then there was the Lewis Bacon farm, which Bacon Street down to Gibson Street, from Gibson Street to the mountain, and that was Captain Daniel Bacon that owned all that land. They were the first 2 settlers, was Wilbur and Bacon, and then Depews came later. In our history book from our centennial, it says that the Decker family was the first settlers in German. There were no Deckers in German. I bowled with some Deckers from Honesdale, but there's no Deckers in German. Decker was down in Peckville where Deckers Bridge is, so they confused the fact that Deckers settled, but they were in Blakely Township, but they were in Blakely. They weren't in German. So the very first families were the Wilburs, the Bacons, and the Depews. So Captain Daniel Bacon, if you can picture this area in the 1820s when there was no cutting, nothing, the trees had to be huge. They were hundreds and hundreds of years old. I mean, the only thing that knocked them down was lightning and rot. So they were gigantic trees. Well, Christopher Wilbur decided now the gravity railroad's starting in Carbondale because now they found coal. So when they started the gravity railroad, what did they need? They needed rails to put the cars on, so they needed lumber. So Christopher Wilbur started logging, hired a whole bunch of people. His house would have been the house on the corner of Gibson and Washington on the west side. So the house on the corner, it's not probably the original house now that's there now, but that's where the Bacon house was. Now, I thought originally it was down in the valley by Matthias's, but that's where his logging operation was. He had houses going down over the hill from Gibson down towards where Matthias's dairy would have been. That was for his workers. All his workers had houses that he put together for them. They were just little shacks for people to live in. But he had wagons and wagons and wagons full of lumber that he cut, and then he floated them down the river to a sawmill. So he built a dam, built a sawmill down by probably the powder mills right now, where they built the dam for the powder mills. So that was the first one. It was called a Western sawmill, Western lumber company, I guess. And then he built a second one up behind where the Episcopal Church is, which would have been where the German park is, the World War I park. He built a second dam there, and then he would float the logs from wherever he cut up in Mayfield all the way down, wherever he could find logs. He cut all the logs and put them on wagons and hauled them with horses, teams of horses. He had 10 teams of horses, is what they said. And he hauled them up to Carbondale to put the rails in for the gravity railroad. So the gravity railroad was, Dr. Powell talked about it, it was 1828, 1829. They were building the gravity railroad. And the first mine was in Archibald down here, 1840s. It was the White Oak mine. And that was where the gravity railroad wanted to come to, because there was a mine to get their coal out. So they had a mine and a couple shafts and stuff, but the White Oak Mine was the actual first breaker and mine that actually started producing coal that they could haul up from this area down here. The tracks came down through German to go to Archibald. So they had different planes, like Dr. Powell talked about, coming down over the mountains. So they'd come from Archibald, they'd come up a plane, come to German to a level area, then they'd go up another plane. And I did have the map, and I don't know if I laid it out, but I guess I didn't, of the gravity railroad. It's the complete map that shows every track that they had in the gravity. It shows the tracks coming down here into German, over in east. Everything was over in east side. So 1857 is the first mine shaft sunk in German. And that was a man named Offerman sunk that mine over where Rapid Pallet is now in 1857. Then Witten and Chitterdom, two guys, decided to build a breaker. So in 1860 they built a coal breaker over where Rapid Pallet is now. That was the first breaker that was built. So that was 1860. 1861, the Vessi Mine was opened, and the Vessi Mine is not in German, but it's connected to German in a big way. It was, when you go out 107, going out of German, and you'll see the foundations on the right-hand side. Those were part of the Vessi Mine. A guy named Camorra owned that mine, and that was actually, it was in Carbondale Township still then in 1861, but it wasn't part of German. The Vessi Mine, the breaker was on the left side, the office was on the left side, and the buildings on the right side were the powder mill for that, where they kept their dynamite, and they kept their horses. Do we have a picture somewhere in here? I think it's in this book here, of that mine with the buildings. This, I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is the Vessi Mine. It's a great big breaker on the left-hand side of 107. When you're going out around the first curves up there, it would have been on the left side of the mountain. And there's a lot of information about the mine here. There shows some of their buildings. This is the Dale. You want to focus in on that because you were there. Mm-hmm. This is the slope shaft that goes down into the mountain that they pulled coal out of. This is on the right-hand side of the mountain if you're going up Rushbrook Street. And if you go up here on the top of the hill where Powell's development is, and you look to that mountain, you can see the path where the road was going right into that mine. But that's the Vessi Mine, and it produced an awful lot of coal, just like the rest of them. And there's another picture I want to show you that had something to do with it, and I hope it's here. But this picture confused me for a lot of years as I would look at it, and I could never figure out where it was, and I still couldn't figure it out. I talked to Dick Muehlheisen a little bit the other day, and he remembered it. So let's see if it's here. Here's the Glenwood Breaker, which is Mayfield, which I think you're seeing a lot of pictures. I think one of the pictures that Ray Belt painted that's over in our museum in the parsonage has a picture of that breaker looking up at the breaker. I want to find that picture. Here's the picture of those buildings that are vacant on the right-hand side going up. They're just stone foundations now, but this is what they looked like back in 1861, 1862, 1863. So those are the foundations. Everybody keeps saying it was somebody's house and this and that and everything else, but that's what here's the picture I'm looking for. Dick Muehlheisen, I'll put this on the table and you can all look through it. He's told me, I'm trying to look at all these buildings and trying to figure out where they are. And the only solution I can come up with was they were behind Freese's lumberyard. And that's what I surmised, and Dick confirmed that for me, because Freese's lumberyard was if you go to the Girl Scout corner in German, where the light is, and you're heading towards Mayfield, where German Supply is now, they have all their stone products and everything there. Fries's Lumberyard sat in there at an angle looking towards the Windsor. And behind that was where they would come from the Vessi Mine. They'd bring their coal down on horses and wagons and drop them off at that. There was a railroad area there where they would come in, bring their wagons, and then the coal cars would be sitting there and they'd load their coal into the coal cars. So I'll put this book over on the table and you can go through it and look at there's a lot of good old pictures in there. So we had 3 mines in German, counting that one. This is from the mines. This hitching post is from the DuPont powder mills, and the coal, of course. German was King Coal. German was one of the most prosperous towns in Lackawanna Valley. With 3 breakers, you had the breaker number 1, we had breaker number 2, which is a little farther up, and we had the Vessi Mine, breaker number 3. And then you add Edgerton, which was in the 1880s, over in East German. You had 4 coal mines just in this little town. And I mean, that's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of coal come out of here. Originally, Judge Gibson from Philadelphia purchased the land that was here for the mines. He purchased everything thinking he was going to make a lot of money investing in it. So he invested a lot of money, and for him it didn't pan out. But we want to go through the names of the town a little bit. I want to back up just a little real quick here. The little cabin that Christopher Wilbur built was called the 4 Mile Inn, and that's where we got the name 4 Mile Point. 4 Mile was 4 miles from Blakely and 4 miles from Carbondale. We were right at the intersection of the Rushbrook Road, which it wasn't even a road back then, but it was just a path, an Indian path. So we got that name of 4 Mile Point. 4 Mile Inn was there. That was what we were there. And then when Daniel Bacon came and became so prosperous, he made tons of money selling lumber. They named it Baconville. So if you'll see in our book, if you read our book, in the 1830s to 1840s, we were called Baconville. And then after Baconville, after Daniel Bacon left the area, he went to New York. I don't know if I couldn't find any more records after that, but he moved to New York. Christopher Wilbur, I think, died in 1848. So they were gone, and then we started to, because of the 1857 mine that they sunk and the 1860 breakers, we became known for coal. So the name changed from Baconville because Bacons were no longer here, to Rushdale because of just named after the Rushbrook Creek. And what it was the people that came through here trapping and hunting and fishing and everything else, they seen it. This is written in books from Dr. Troop and a few others that wrote some real early books on the history of Lackawanna Valley, that they found so many teeming, colorful fish in the river, in the rushing brook, they called it. So we went from the rushing brook to Rushbrook, and we became known as Rushdale. Now, there is also mention of the name Randville, and I'm thinking the only thing I can't find anything definitive, but the only thing I can think of for Randville was East German, the Nebraska section, which wasn't part of German, but it mentions Randville in several articles, and it all seems to be assimilated with the east side of town where the miners lived and where the mines were. So the name Randville comes up every once in a while in an article, but it doesn't say exactly where Randville was compared to Rushdale. But Rushdale and Randville were at the same time period. So then when Judge Gibson purchased the land and started making the breaker work and selling some coal, they named the town after him, Gibsonburg. So Rushdale was all through the 1840s. Gibsonburg was in the 1850s up until 1860s and early 1870s. Then the name got changed to German in 1874. So that's the history of the names of the town. But now we get into the 1860s, and if I can find out where I dropped my glasses so I can see what I'm doing. I heard them fall, so I know they're here somewhere. Well, I guess. Oh well, we'll figure it out. So I have a list of a bunch of places that were here in the 1860s. 1860s is the next time period. Are they up there someplace? There. If I need them, I'll use them now. In the 1860s, the first thing I looked at was the Methodist Episcopal Society was formed in 1862. So that's really early in German. And it was formed, and they met in the building that's down on Main Street, Dulce Dunham, which is still here. It still has the name on the front of the building. That was a schoolhouse, meeting room, church, and later a hotel. It was called Messett's Hotel, Messett's Hall. So that little white building was a gathering point in German. So the Methodist Episcopal Society formed in 1862. There was a minister from Peckville that came out and ministered to everybody, and that was the first religious organization in town. And in 1870, they decided they were going to purchase a piece of land, so they purchased this land where we sit now in 1870, started to build a church 1871, and opened it in 1872. Now that church is here. This little, there goes something else. This little church here is the original church that was here in 1870. It's small compared to the church that's here now, but it probably in 1870 was a pretty good sized church. The church was so well used, in 1875 they built the parsonage, which is the building right next door. So that building is still here from 1875. And then just to give you a complete history of this, the church was so filled with people, and they had standing room only in the church, they decided they needed to build a bigger church. So the parishioners built the original church by themselves. They tore it down by themselves, and they started building this church in 1890. Now the records that we had, that I've been reading, all say that the church was built in 1892. So we were going to celebrate our 130th anniversary of this building this year, 1892. But since then, I've researched a little bit farther and found a German press newspaper that says February 23rd of 1891 was the first service in this church. So over 131 years old in this building. And this building was built by the parishioners. It was cost like $30,000 to build a whole building. And John German supplied some of the money for it, and he held a mortgage on it up until the end. But he was very generous. He helped the St. James Episcopal build their church as well. So this church would have been the first church in German, 1870. Dulce Domum was there in 1860. Some of these were probably here in the 1850s. I have a map and I can't find it. We had it before. We had a lot of stuff in that parsonage, and it's a small little building. And when Walter passed away and we got to go into his house and bring everything over here, we didn't have any room to put it. So it all got put into that little parsonage over there, and we had a cleaning, session a couple of weeks back. some of the ladies came over and organized it a little bit better so that we could still keep our meat, because the table was completely filled with stuff. We had no place to put it, and it's still overfilled. We have to get into the new building, but there was a map that was there that is the map that's on the brochure that we use for this here, and it was started in 1850s, so it shows the shaft in the map where they sunk the first shaft, and it shows some of the early houses in German. The map actually has a date on it of 1867 or something like that. That was when it was finished. That's when they finished mapping the area. So it was really started in the 1850s and finished in the 1860s. So it's really not accurate, because some of the buildings that were here in the 1860s, which is like the breaker, which was built in 1860, is not on the map. The shaft is there, 1857, but the map itself says it's built, that the map is dated 1860s. So it didn't actually show it. There was a house where Debbie's Flower Shop is in 1860s. There was a house next to it where Danny Couture lives in the 1860s. There was a house next to that in the 1860s. And let's see, there was a few more. There was a bakery. Jones's Bakery was here in the same block, just a little farther up by where the gun shop is now. There was H. Davis's house in the 1860s, which was up by Wayne's Diner. They were in the 1860s. There was right on the corner across from the Windsor where the gas station is was J.R. McLaughlin's place in 1860. And let's see if there's anything else. Okay, in the 700 block going up towards German was Depews' house and his land. So he owned the upper part of German in the 1860s. And let's see, William Jenkins lived here. He was the minister of the Methodist Church, the first minister in the 1850s and 1860s. He lived up on the left-hand side in a house on Main Street going towards Mayfield. There was a J. Dunn, D-U-N-N, who lived in the 700 block of Main Street in the 1860s. The Merritts, Phil Merritt and R. Merritt, both lived in next to each other on the left-hand side going up towards Mayfield in the 700 block. And the Graves Drug Store was here in the 1860s. And there's a bottle here from Graves Drug Store. And let's see, now we get into the hotels. And the first hotel was built by Louis Pizer in 1866. And the location cannot be found. It says it was 1 block west of his second hotel. His second hotel, we know where it is. So his second hotel was built in a little bit later, but Louis Pizer built the first hotel called the 4 Mile Hotel in 1866, early. In 1866, John Nicholson, built the Windsor Inn. The Windsor was built in 1866 as Farmers Hotel, and it's still here. It's like Charlie says that his business was the only business that's still here that was here. Well, the Windsor's still here, and it was here, but it's not the same family owned. Charlie has that distinction. So the Windsor Inn was built as the Farmers Hotel. It was 3 stories. It was on the corner where it is. It had an addition on the side. If you're looking at the Windsor on the left-hand side, there was a small addition, probably no bigger than from maybe pole to pole here, and there was a barber shop in there back in the 1860s. It changed hands numerous times, and Dick Muhlheisen's grandmother, Olive Edmonds, owned it for the longest time. Olive Edmonds also built Assembly Hall Assembly Hall was built right next to the Windsor. There was an Assembly Hall there first before she built hers. And she also built the White Elephant. And if you're not familiar with the White Elephant, it's the row house going up Rushbrook Street on the right-hand side, across from the Windsor, on the same block. She built that. She went to Philadelphia and seen the row houses in Philadelphia and came back with the idea that she was going to build it, so she built that. And she also built Harmony Hart Camp. Harmony Hart Camp is up by Hart Lake. She also built that. So she was pretty famous as being ahead of her time and doing all the things that she did. So we're into the next hotel built was the St. George Hotel. The St. George Hotel was Louis Piser's second hotel. We have pictures of St. George Hotel. St. George's Hotel had like wagon wheel designs on the upstairs of it. And for people who don't know where it was, it burnt down in, let's see, there's a relative of somebody here that owned it, but it was Earl's Townhouse. Where Earl's Townhouse, that was St. George Hotel, built by Louis Piser. So that one block west of that would put it on Madison Avenue, the original hotel. But which one of those buildings can we get somebody to bring us their deeds that go back to Luzerne County that can tell us where that hotel was? That's a project that I'm going to have, so I'm going to have to find that. It's going to drive me crazy until we find it. The next hotel that was built was the Sweeney Hotel, built by I can't think of his name now. Anyway, it was built directly across from the Hotel Windsor. Right on the corner where the gas station is was the Sweeney Hotel. Behind that Sweeney Hotel was a shed back in the 1800s that was a fire company. A very unknown fire company. It was the third fire company in German, and it was to support the upper part of town. The artesians were in the 1880s, the crystals were in the 1880s, and this was also in it. It was called the Stocker Fire Company. J.D. Stocker put up the money to build it, and it was there to protect the upper part of German. Never built a fire station. All they had was a hose cart you pulled by hand, and there's no record, no pictures of them, no records, but the only thing we can find, and Joe Pachkowski, that is a phenomenal fire collector and writer, he wrote books on all the fire companies in the area, he can tell us more about it. He knows more about that than I do, but there was a fire company there on that side of town. So that was our third fire company. The Messett Hotel was the Dulce Doma, it was called a hotel back then. The Avery Hotel. The Avery Hotel was built on the corner of Franklin Street and Washington Avenue. It was known by most of us as Collins's. Where Collins's was the Avery Hotel back in the 1800s. There was also Edwards Hotel. Edwards had a bar and rooms above it, so that was considered a hotel. There was all kinds of halls. Reimer's Hall. Reimer's Hall is where Jimmy Riley lived. He just sold it. It's on Gibson Street. It looks just like a house with apartments underneath and apartments going up top. But that was Reimer's Hall. There's still stuff on the walls in the attic that can tell you it was a meeting room, meeting place. A lot of churches met there. It was like, I guess, community-wise, it was like the Borough Building would have been, right? Where everybody had their meetings. So we had a Carpenter's Hall. The Carpenter's Hall was in the Windsor. There was Gilmartin Hall. I'm gonna think of all the ones off the top of my head without looking at any notes because I've got 100 pages up here. There were some major fires. I'm only doing early history, so I'm only doing 1800 stuff because I could be here for days. Days. So in the 1800s, some of the fires, 1884, the graded school was destroyed by fire. Now, to give you a little bit of the history of the school, I have a book that tells me a little bit about that. The land was purchased from a guy named Hill, and it was purchased on the corner of Madison Avenue and Bacon Street, right where the school was when I was growing up, where the Crystal Fire Company is now. That was the original graded school. They brought in a school from someplace already built. It was a little dinky, like one-room schoolhouse like everybody else had, and they placed it on that piece of land. Well, then they contracted in 1870, right after the borough was founded, the Gibsonburg School Board held its first meeting at the schoolhouse, now known as Dulce Dunham. That was the schoolhouse before they went to this property. The president was Henry Neimer. Secretary was James Dunn, which is a famous name in German. A lot of us know that. Henry Kennedy, there were Kennedys here. Patrick Mullen, Michael Roach, and Giles Scott. The first item that they had was levying 26 mills, 13 for the teachers and 13 for building purposes in school tax, and a resolution to erect a new graded school to be 46 by 32 by 22. That replaced the one schoolhouse, Dulce Dunham, and this was what they decided they were going to build. So in April of 1870, the salaries were fixed at $70 a month. They were overpaid even then. $32 for females. Females only got $32. The first teachers in the district were Miss Gerard Ayers. Their Ayers are still in German. Miss Celinda Parker. They were the two teachers. The board adopted to purchase 2 lots offered by John B. Smith, not Hill, Smith, at the corner of Bacon and 2nd, Madison Avenue for $550, and they decided they were going to build a school. School was completed in June of 1871. On August 1871, R.M. Stocker was appointed principal. The school had a salary of $62.50 a month. And let's see. Okay, and that leads up to the fire. So here's another book that people can look at. That leads up to the fire. The new graded school was built in the 1870s, and it burned down in 1884. 1884 was the same year that the Welsh Congregational Church was built on Madison Avenue, which is the church that we're restoring for our museum. 1884. So that was a major fire, burnt the whole school right to the ground. And then they had to build a new one. And pictures of the new one, which is this school that I remember. There was a grade school, a middle school, and a high school, all built on the corner where the Crystal Fire Company was. 3 big buildings. They were all connected. There was tunnels underground that went from one building to the other, and then there was a walkway above that went from one building to another. And we used to sneak in there and go down. We had the thing that cleaned the erasers was in the basement of the grade school. They had a little belt, and you put the erasers on there, and it cleaned all the chalk off the erasers. And we used to go down there and had dust all over us and everything else. And then we'd go through the tunnel and run over the other building. You know, but that was one of the big fires. The other one was the parish hall. Parish hall was the Catholic hall. Catholic Church was moved from Archibald to here in the 1870s and early between 70s and 80s, and it was placed behind the big red brick house on the top of the hill on Main Street where Mary Golden lives. Mary Golden lives in that nice big brick house. It's the next house from the corner when you go up towards Battenberg's Funeral Home on the right. The church was put behind that. And they never really got to have a lot of services in there because they decided they were going to use it as a hall and build a brand new church where they built the church now. This church over here was built in the 1890s, I believe, 1880s. So that Catholic church, the big brick church, the beautiful church was built there, and they were going to use this church that they had services in a couple times as a hall. They were going to use it as their meeting hall and have dinners and stuff in there. 1897, the parish hall burnt. It was St. Mary's Church, what it was originally. 1897, the Trans-Sioux residence on the corner of Bacon and Jefferson. That would be where I live. One of them 4 houses on the corner, and I would have to say it's the one empty lot on the corner where the tree grows right on the corner. There was probably a house right there. There's nothing there now. That's probably where this house was, 1897. And then the engine house of the Delaware and Hudson Colliery over in East German was 1898. George Berry's house on 4th Street, which would have been Lincoln Avenue, was in 1899. The Rich Building, R-I-C-H, that was he had a big business here in town, sold clothing and stuff. That was 1899. And then there was Mr. and Mrs. James Evans on 4th Street, and the 4-cent store. You have dollar stores now. We had a 4-cent store in Germany. Okay? That was before the 5 and dime. The 4-cent store. The 4-cent store was up on Washington Avenue on the left-hand side going towards Mayfield. There was also a bar that bottled their own beer. I think it's, can't think of the name of it now. Brent Coons has the bottle from that. It's the only one I know of. He has the bottle from that bar that bottled their own beer. Now, the only 3 that I know of in German that bottled their beer was that one on Washington Avenue. It was only there for a year, and it burnt down. And the other 2 are the Bottlers and Muldoons. So we have a Bottlers and a Muldoons, and if Brent Coons will give up his bottle, and I know he won't because his mother won't give up the vases either that she has from the Laurel Glass Company. So then there was a fire in 1899. It was a barn owned by Mrs. Burdish over in East German. And then in 1899, again in May, the first fire on the 4-cent store was May 6th and 7th, and then May 10th it burnt again. And that was owned by William Merritt. So the 2 Merritt brothers owned houses in that block. So those were the fires of the 1800s. So I'm not going to bore you with anything else as far as fires. Let's see what else we want to cover because we'll be here all night. World War I and the Civil War is in this book, but World War I is too late. It's after the 1800s. So we're only going to go through real quick the people that were in the Civil War. And I brought the hat to show you the Civil War. This is the hat that the guys used. And this bottle is from that time period, 1860s. These bullets are Civil War bullets, and the cotton is representative of the cotton that was being picked by the slaves that they were fighting over. So that gives you a little bit of time period, 1800s. So we're going to give you a real quick rundown here. Civil War vets of German, John Ayers. The Ayers family is still here. M.H. Barber, William Hunter, George Forrest, Patrick Farrell, Edward Howell, David Henry, Henry Tripp, T-R-I-P-P, same as the Tripps from Scranton, John Yothers, John Humphrey, James Nicholson, which is Alice Grzybowski's grandfather, R.J. Snyder, and William Skull. And 4 of these are buried in our German cemetery. So 4 of the Civil War veterans. And we have some from the Spanish-American War, which would have been in the 1800s as well. James Nicholson, William Trotter, Joseph Delmore, and Mag Gannon. They were the veterans from that time period. So we can put that book if anybody wants to look at that after we're done. And let's see what else we can go from there. So now, Civil War time. This would have been what they used.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. They no longer loaded.
That's the bayonet he would have got stuck with. This is the cleaning rod. This is the strap, same kind of strap they had. This is an original gun. This is not a replica. This is this is 1870 model, but it's the same gun they would have used in the Civil War. I also have another one, it's a year newer than that, but this one is in beautiful condition. This one you could still fire. It's a 50 caliber. If you look at the size of the hole that would have came out of, you look at a bullet now and you look at a 22 bullet, it's about that wide, and this is a 50 caliber. So you can imagine getting hit by one of these lead balls or one of these bullets in here, which are about that big with a point on them back in the 1860s, and you wonder when you see all those pictures of all the dead people in all of the movies and all of the books that you read about the Civil War. I mean, you just can't imagine trying to survive being hit by something like that. So in the Civil War, in Civil War times, we had a lot of people from German that were in the Civil War and survived it. We also had a murder in German, 1867. So I wanted to hit on that a little bit because I'm not going to go through this paperwork and stuff. There's too much here. But in 1867, Joseph Knight was drinking in the Windsor in a farmer's hotel with his wife and another couple. And he came out of the Windsor and was walking up the street and said, "Before the night is over, I'm going to kill me a Welshman." Okay? So he's walking up Main Street from the Windsor, and he gets in front of Oliver Morgan's house. Now, Oliver Morgan's house, from the maps that I have, it's on there, to me is around where Williams's house is, where Terry Williams and Jill Stone live. Somewhere in that, it's in either that house or Loretta's. It's one of those two houses there. That's where Oliver Morgan lived. There's articles about the streets in German being terrible and muddy and everything, and it mentions in front of Oliver Morgan's house. But anyway, he is walking up the street and he comes across Hopkins Jenkins, who was a Welshman. And the two of them started to talk, and I guess bad words were said, and he went to push or punch Hopkins Jenkins, and Hopkins Jenkins pulled out a pistol, and as he was falling backwards, he shot Joseph Knight and killed him. So he didn't beat up the Welshman that he said he was going to. So anyway, there was a murder trial. There was people on both sides that came as witnesses. And there's a whole bunch of accounts of that in the Scranton Republican that you can look up. You can go online and find it. And the trial went on for days and days and days. And Joseph Knight was John German's brother-in-law. In fact, the name Knight is on our windows upstairs in the church here on one of the big stained glass windows. So we're into the 1860s. We have bakeries. We have livery stables.
What happened? What happened to the guy?
Well, he died. He got shot and he was dead.
Yeah, but what happened to the guy
trial.
Jenkins?
Well, he sort of got off. Self-defense. There were far more Welshmen in German than there were anything else. It was said that there were more Welsh in northeastern Pennsylvania than there were in Wales. because they all came here to work in the mines. I was gonna bring my Welsh flag, and I should have. But I can just picture Joseph Knight with his derby on, walking down the street, going up to see this guy and push him, and then next thing you know, he falls over backwards and he's dead. You know, he had his suit on, he was all dressed up, and he was a wealthy guy working for John German, and now he is dead. I do have a little pamphlet here, which I'm going to put on the table too. Dugout canoes. This is up in Clifford. There's a dugout canoe in their museum that had to go with the Indians. I didn't want to. I set it on the side here and forgot that it was here. So now we're into 1870s. So now we're into the 1870s. That's when this map here is 1873, where it's Gibson. We're now Gibsonburg. And you'll see a ton of names in this map. Pull some of this out of here. And these coins are all from 1870. So you can see it. These little spikes are from the Gravity Railroad. These are little gravity spikes. This tells you about the mini sink path for the Indians. That goes with the Indians. The mini sink path went up. The mini sink was up in the Delaware River to the right-hand side out by Strasburg. Some of the names on here, Mulholland is on that little map over there. Mulholland's owned the land where the Avery Hotel was built, which was Collins's. Mulholland's owned the two properties back to back there. And John German owned everything down over the hill. John German came here and purchased everything from Judge Gibson. He worked in the mines in Scranton, came here from Redham, England, worked in the mines in Scranton, up on West Mountain for a while, then went down and worked on another mine in Scranton. Then he worked in coming up the valley in Oliphant and Peckville, purchased a mine, and then came to German and purchased the mine from Gibson. He made it work. Gibson probably, got his money back, and maybe that's about it. There's no record, doesn't say anything, but John German took millions of tons of coal out of German. Became a multi-millionaire. Down where the winery is was John German's where it was his general store. He had a home just up the road from that. He owned all the property up the hill, all the way up to the house next to the parsonage here, and that's who we purchased the land off of for this year. But he owned all of East German. If you go over Delaware Street and you go across Delaware where Bottler's was, go to the next block, Hudson, and not Hudson, Elm I think it is, but every little house on that right-hand side were all miners' homes owned by John German. He owned, I think, something like 34 or 40 properties at that time. Barnabas Carter, which is a relative of Walter Avery's, he had a store another hotel. I think thought of this now. The Forest House. There's a Forest House in Scranton, but there was a Forest House in German. If you go out of Bridge Street, where the winery is, at the stop sign, and look straight across, there was a big hotel there called the Forest House. So that was long before Matthias's Dairy was there. And right next to that on the left was Barnabas Carter's store. It was a general store. That was Walter Avery's relative. So that would have been there. John German had his office, he had a store, he had a general store, and later it became like a silk mill. The two railroads that were here, the D&H and the O&W, both had train stations here. The D&H train station was over by Bottler's, just go underneath the underpass, and then a big empty lot on the right-hand side where they parked cars. That was the D&H station. That was a passenger station. Went to Scranton all the time. Back and forth, people got on it to go to work in Scranton, go to church down there, go to shop down there. That was their means of transportation back then. Before that, we had stagecoaches. There was a stagecoach that came up through German from Blakely to Carbondale every day, and Main Street was called Plank Road. It still is Plank Road in Mayfield, but it was called Plank Road back then. It was the Providence to Carbondale Turnpike. That's what it was called. The original road was not where it is now. The original road followed the Indian path along the river. Part of that Indian path is still visible in Mayfield. It's the only place I found it in all of Lackawanna County, because everything else has been developed. There's pictures in our book. If you look at the early history of German book, which is the big one over there, I think in the beginning of that, Walter has the pictures that I took when I took him up to show it to him. There's cobblestones that line the little stagecoach line, and they just wind around the river, and they're only wide enough for like a carriage or a wagon. That's all they are, and that was the original road that went from Providence to Carbondale. There was an Indian here that guided some of the people. There's the pictures. Joanne has them there. The cobblestones that are there. Walter took those pictures. He went with me. But there was an Indian that guided the early people that were looking for coal here, the Worth brothers and so on. He lived in a moss-covered cabin down the valley, and I guess he was an old eccentric Indian, but he knew the area and guided them. And that was the path that they took. Later on, Main Street was built in the 1850s. Was when Main Street was put in. It was Plank Road then, so that would have been back in the 1850s. Now this map is 1873. It shows the coal breaker. That map there is 1889, which is the map that's in the Borough Building. We have several copies of that, several copies of this. I'm trying to think if there's something special on here. Oh, it does. This shows the pond that was behind Joni Longworth's building. She was fascinated when she came in and seen this, because her building was flooded during the flood. She goes, no wonder. But there was a pond on Jefferson Avenue, right where Jefferson and Franklin, somewhere on there. It would have been right about where the power plant was when we were kids, the PP&L plant. There was a pond there, and the water ran from there down through.
It still floods there.
It ran down through the alleyway behind Paul's house, down along behind Paul's house, where the hill goes down, the lower part. It went down in there by Esgro's, and then came back around and came back out into the alleyway that comes from the alleyway that's across the street from here. It comes out to Franklin Street, and then it went across Franklin Street, and it went down into a little pond that sat right where Joni Longworth's building is, which was a bar at one time. Joni Longworth's bar was a bar, Pelax bar growing up, and it had a still. There was a still in the basement of Joni Longworth's bar, in the kitchen. And Dick Muehlheisen, I think, told me that one. Let's see what else we want to touch on real quick. Is anybody getting tired of hearing me talking already? I do want to hit some of the businesses and a little bit of Isaac Tripp. Now this came from James and Nancy Durst. This little article here on early pioneer Isaac Hewitt Carey. He was from Scott Township, took up residence with his daughter, Mrs. Isaac Jones, who lived on Main Street in German. He was a familiar figure on the streets of German, was a great walker until his death at age 91. He thought nothing of walking 10 or 15 miles. The elderly Isaac, a rugged old character, would often tell of the exciting times in this region when he was a young man. There was abundance of game in the area, and during his lifetime he had killed over 100 deer up on Carey Mountain, which is up here. He liked to narrate his exciting experiences with the large panther in the woods near the toll gate on Wildcat Road. Isaac died in 1901 in German, was buried in the old Carey graveyard in Mondale. Let's see if there's anything. Albert Carey, his son, worked as a blacksmith in the Music powder mills and died at his home in Mayfield, 1937. Just a little background on it. That's just one of the guys who lived here. Really wasn't one of the first settlers, but lived here and told a lot of stories about German. And now, let's see, I want to end with some of the businesses that were here. And I had a, oh, here it is. Some of the, let's see. Those are fires, and more fires. I wanted to touch a little bit about the fire in German, but that was in the 1900s. But I want to explain a little bit about German, becoming German. They met, the first meeting was in Dulce Donum, when they had the first elections there, when they first became a borough. They were part of Luzerne County, Blakely Township, and Luzerne County was where we were when we were German, when we first became German. And we didn't become Lackawanna County until we were the last or 67th county in Pennsylvania. So we were always, a lot of our records are still down, and a lot of Mayfield's records are still down in Luzerne County. So we have to go there and search for deeds, we have to search for the history. If you're looking for something, that might be a mistake when you're looking for something, because it's not going to be Lackawanna County. So you want to look in Luzerne County when you're searching for anything up until Lackawanna County was formed. Let's see, where was I here? I had a list of businesses that I wanted to touch on, but German was the first elections were held in the Dulce Donum, and John German was elected mayor. S.D. Davis. S.D. Davis came here in 1869. He built his house on the corner of Bacon and Washington. It's still there. So if you leave here and go down to this corner, the house on the right-hand side was Dr. S.D. Davis's house. It had 3 stories. The other top story they tore off. It's only 2 stories now, but that was Dr. S.D. Davis. And right next to it is well, it used to be a dress factory when we were kids. It was Stanley Hollowich had it for a warehouse for cigarettes and whatever his business was. But before that, there was a great big building there with an opera house upstairs. And S.D. Davis built that building. They also held lodges in there, different lodges. We had the Ancient Order Hibernians, we had the Odd Fellows, we had the Masonic Lodge, we had the APA Lodge, we had, let's see, I had a book on organizations here. And the Mason Lodge, Aurora 523, is still here. It's the only one still left. And its 150th anniversary is coming up next year. So there will be a celebration for Aurora Lodge over at, hopefully at St. Michael's, but some of the lodges that were here were the Rushbrook Lodge of Oddfellows, that was the Oddfellow Lodge, the Mayflower Lodge, Sons of St. George, the Gibsonburg Building and Loan Association. There was a ton, we have badges from all the different lodges over there, different organizations. The Mayflower Lodge, Sons of St. George, was organized in 1871. John Gardner was president, John Nicholson vice president, John Ayers secretary, Oliver Morgan was treasurer. There were 70 charter members. They didn't last so long. Aurora Lodge, 1873, the officers that were installed were Sumner Davis, W.M., he was the worshipful master, C.D. Vale was the senior warden, Oliver Morgan was the junior warden, Thomas Rennie was secretary, John German treasurer, and they were the charter members of that lodge as well. John German was very active in German, that is why his name was all over the place. There's another book that people can go through with all the organizations in it. Walter Avery did such a phenomenal job with putting all these books together. It's just amazing. I do want to touch on the fire, even though it wasn't in the 1800s. But I want to touch on this fire because it was a big part of history. It was in 1904, right after the turn of the century. There's different conflicting newspaper articles about it. One said 7 buildings, and there were really only 6 buildings. One said that the Windsor burned down, and it didn't. But the little barber shop on the side caught on fire, and they had to tear it down. So that's probably what they wanted to put in the paper, but didn't. But it started in a livery stable. There was a livery stable behind the Windsor. There was a building there was Assembly Hall, a wooden building right next to the Windsor, a great big assembly hall. They had roller skating and movie theaters and everything else in there. There was a building over the creek, had a business on both sides and a house on top, right over the creek. And then it had, a drugstore and Jones's Bakery next to that. And then Dr. Matthew Shields, who the founder of First Aid, according to some people, that'll be another lecture sometime. Dr. Shields' house was there, and then there was a driveway in between, and then the German bank. Now, the German bank is not the German bank that we know now. It's the original German bank that was built in 1902. It was to the left of the German bank that's there now. This fire started in the livery stable behind the Windsor, and it spread to the Assembly Hall. It spread to a pool hall that was behind the buildings over the creek. There was John Marion's house, which was 2 stories. He lived up top, businesses on the bottom. Staples Livery Stable next to that. Jones Drugstore next to that. And Dr. Shields' house. They were all 2-story buildings except for Assembly Hall, which was 3, and the Windsor, which was 3. 6 buildings in all were completely destroyed by fire. It was the largest fire in German. It was in 1904. According to this, it says 8 buildings were destroyed, and that's including the sheds and parts of the livery stable. That's not the main street buildings, but it stopped only because the bank was a brick building, or it would have continued. It was because they couldn't put it out. The fire companies back then had pull carts, where they pulled them with whatever horses. They didn't have fire trucks yet in 1904. They still had horses and wagons and pulled the hose carts. So they couldn't put a fire of that magnitude out. It was the largest fire ever to be in German. Destroyed all those buildings. And now the new bank was built, I think, in 1923 on the property where it is now. Then they purchased the property next to it, and they purchased the property next to it, and then they purchased the property next to it. So the bank now is on 4 separate pieces of property. Nick Santa Cross and his wife lived in one house. Dr. Shields' house was one of them. Dr. Shields' house is the spot where the original bank is now. So if you look at the bank, the right-hand side of that bank is where Dr. Matthew Shields' house was. They sold it to the bank, I think, for $1,000. That's the land after the fire. In the 1800s, business-wise, there was 1881. We had Battenberg's Furniture Store. They were there in 1881. They're continued same now. Allen's Store was in the 1890s. Allen's Store was on this side of the street. And back in the 1800s, you see a picture that was on Facebook. It shows Allen's Store. That was on this side of the street. The store where Allen's Store was Baker's Store. That was Baker Brothers Store. It was the biggest store in German at that time, and then Allen's moved into it when Baker's died. C.D. Winters had a store where Debbie Panunzi has Debbie's Flower Shop, Debbie Clea. I know her father is Panunzi, so that was a C.D. Winters general store. I started to touch on the railroad stations, and I want to finish that. The D&H station, where it was over by Bottler's, was the passenger. The O&W station had a passenger and a freight station. The freight station, if you went down Franklin Street to the bottom of the hill between Debbie's and what was Collins's, you went down the bottom of the hill. The freight station was on the left, and the train, the O&W passenger station, was on the right. So if you go down the hill, there was a station on both sides. The Laurel Cut Glass Factory was here in the 1800s and burnt down in the 1900s. And that would have been farther down past the freight station and out towards the railroad tracks, because the railroad tracks came around and went up through Mayfield, and they used to have the Laurel Cut Glass Factory. Now this is from the Laurel Cut Glass Factory.
It's crystal, yeah.
It's crystal.
Yeah.
This was a gift from Tom Zente to us at our dinner for our centennial. And the only other one like that I know of is in my house. My grandmother had one. So when I seen this, I said, "Oh my God, that's mine! I have to go." And I went and I pinged mine, and it's crystal.
Sure they are.
So I have one in my house just like it. The vases that Mrs. Coons has, we have a picture in one of our books of the vases, but they are very beautiful. They're about this tall.
Yeah.
They're very colorful, and they twist as they go up. There's little ribs in them, and they're like orange, and I don't know what other colors are mixed in there.
They are called end of the day glass.
End of the day glass?
It is what they had at the end of the day. And when my grandfather wanted them made, his friend took all the end of the day glass.
Oh,
That's what
wow.
they made from.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, and it's the only, not a lot of them. There's a catalog on that you can go online. You can buy a copy of the Laurel Cut Glass.
Wow.
I should have brought it with me. We have a copy over in our I bought it thinking it was a rare piece of history that, you know, there's only one in the country that had this, and it ends up it's a replica of the original catalog of Laurel Cut Glass. So we do have it. So if you have glass and you want to find out if yours came from Laurel Cut Glass, we do have a copy of that book in our library over here in the parsonage. We have a little Bible type piece about this big, made of cut glass from the Laurel Cut Glass Factory. It's only about this tall and it's shaped like a book. It has little ribs on the top of it, and it's beautiful. But it came from Laurel Cut Glass, and Walter Avery had it in his glass case. So we do have that. It's wrapped in velvet in a little case where nobody can touch it or see it. So it'll be on display once we open up the museum, if that ever happens.
Were there other cut glass places in town, or was
There
that?
was only one cut glass
one?
place in German.
And that was it?
There was two glass factories, but one was cut glass and the other was Dearborn Glass Company.
Yeah, but this.
And Dearborn Glass Company was here in the 40s, late 40s,
Oh,
early
okay, so it is.
50s. My grandfather worked there. They made picture tubes for televisions.
Okay.
And then they went into glass, and we have a lot of that glass. It's all over the place. It's not very valuable, but it's different. It's nice, and you'll find it in different parts of the country. There were two Dearborn Glass companies. One was in Dearborn, Michigan, and the other one was here. So they made the same type of stuff in Dearborn, Michigan, so we don't know how much of it there was. But businesses in German, there was...
Weeping Gold, that was made over in Dearborn.
Dearborn had the gold leaf in all of the glass. We have plates that are big plates with an eagle in the center, and it's like white glass with an eagle, and then it's got gold around the edges.
But this is, the outside is called Weeping Gold.
Weeping gold?
It's all gold.
Okay.
It's sort of pottery. They didn't make it, did they?
I don't think so. They just made glass, but it had gold. And somebody said it was real gold leaf. that was into there, and I want to melt down one of my glass plates and find out. But businesses, there were livery stables, there was harness shops, there was Walke's livery, there was Staples livery. There was a livery stable on Rushbrook Road, right where the White Elephant was. There was a meat market right on the corner of Madison and Rushbrook, where Debbie's Flower Shop was originally. There was Langman's store there. Dawson Langman had a meat market there. They had a gas pump there at one time. But there was a grocery store there in the 1800s. The house right across the caddy corner from that, where Tom Rosemorgy lived, was there in the 1800s. We had Merritt's Meat Market. We had there was a hat store on the building right next to German, to the parsonage here. There was a hat store. There were barber shops everywhere. Griffith's Barber Shop. There probably was 5 or 6 of them. There was, I would say, there was 8 to 10 confectionery stores in German in the 1800s. I'll bet you at least 6 or 7 meat markets in German. Most of them were on Main Street.
Chinese laundry.
We had a Chinese laundry right down the hill here in German.
How
There
about
weren't very
hardware?
many businesses down that side in the 1800s. Most of them were all up here. But there were restaurants on Main Street in the 1800s. There was a guy named Demora that had a meat market, or had a restaurant. Solomon's had a hardware store in the 1800s. Sullivan's, M.H. Sullivan had a shoe store. See, this one here.
Yeah, I remember that.
Mills Company. If you went down behind Debbie's Flower Shop, you had Nicholson's Lumber Yard, where the Miller Casket Company was. That was Nicholson's Lumber Yard. And to the right of that was C.L. Bell's Lumber Yard. There was another one there. They also had a planing mill, big wood mill works on Main Street, just down from where the fire was, where the bank was. So it would have been around where Marie Evans, Tom Evans had their store on Main Street, which is now a storage facility. There was a big planing mill there. Trying to think of what other, there were doctors. We had doctors, it was a
I can't forget him.
Milligrew, I think it was. He was a dentist back in that time. Dr. Davis, Dr. Graves. There was Oddfellows Hall. Oddfellows Hall was on the corner across from the Windsor, on the empty lot that's there. That was a great big old wooden building. And on the first floor was Graves Pharmacy. And there was another business in there.
Co-op.
I can't think of what it was. But it was in the basement. It was in the basement of that same thing with Graves. And right next to that was Jimmy Steele's Candy Store. That building is still there. It's that little apartment that sits by itself right next to the empty lot where Coggins had his barber shop, and I had a little baseball card store in the other side of it. It's a tiny little building. That was Jimmy Steele's Candy Store. We have a picture of that in one of the books. Freese's Lumber Yard, and they had a gas station at one time in the 1950s, probably, Freese's gas station. But they had a big lumber yard. That would have been right where the German has their stone lot there, German Supply. That would have been Freese's Lumber Yard. Next to that, it was Herbert's Garage, but between that was where Ann Boylan lived when when I was a kid. It was Burdick's photo studio in the 1800s, and before that it was Kramer's photo studio. So early 1800s it was Kramer's. Now Kramer lived right next to the Welsh Congregational Church that we're working on now. The house right to the left of that. If you were looking at the building, it would have been to the right. That was Kramer's house. We got a sword from in there that the guy who lives there now found in the attic. It's a Knights of Pythias sword with the helmet on the top, and it's a beautiful, ornate little sword. But He must have been a member of the Knights of Pythias. Kramer's, let's see. We had the Merritts had a meat market. Dunn's had a business. Muldoon's had a bar. And I'm trying to think about some of the other quick hotels. Does anybody have any questions on anything that I didn't cover? Is there anything you would like to know? Fire companies were the 1800s, Crystals and Artesian.
What do you mean by Oddfellows? I know there's one in Carbondale by the old Fate Rose School, and they say that's the measurement point for Carbondale. But what do you mean by Oddfellows?
It's probably, I'd have to read it in the book of what it was. The
What
Oddfellows
exactly?
was a name of an
It
organization.
was an organization, just
It was
a-
just an organization of, they must have been Oddfellows.
Yeah, I know it's in Carbondale too, and
Well, I couldn't really give you a definitive answer on that because I didn't read up on it, but I know there were Oddfellows all over the place because Oddfellows Hall was there. That burnt down as well. That hall, I think, burnt down in 1903. That was one of the
did that
fires.
hardware store you spoke of, did that evolve into Thayer's? My mother worked at Thayer's Hardware.
No,
And she always said that's where she worked, right, Jeff? Thayer's Hardware, in Germany.
no, these hardwares were lumber mills. The only hardware store back then would have been Egan's hardware store.
He always worked at
And
Thayer's.
that's where he's got the jersey from Egan's Hardware. Egan's Hardware was built after the fire where Brenzel's building is now, the insurance agency. Donna Brenzel has it.
Yeah, I know you
Well,
mean.
that would have been, back in our time, after the fire in 1905, that would have been Egan's Hardware. Judge Egan
Yeah.
had it, and it was Egan's and somebody else.
Egan and O'Donnell.
Egan and O'Donnell.
Yeah, my mother always spoke of working at Thayer's.
That letterhead on the top of that letter dates them back to 1890s.
1890s, but they were in a different location.
Yeah, they're still in Germany.
Yeah.
Where
Does anybody have any questions, or any, like, answered, anything that I didn't cover?
Where was the trial held? That trial that you spoke of, that murder trial?
Trial was in Scranton. Trial was in Scranton. In front of Collins Hotel, if you remember as a kid, in front of the Collins Hotel was a little set of steps,
Yes, I remember.
and they were concrete steps. I think it was 2 steps. That was the step for the stagecoach line.
Okay.
The stagecoach used to come up Main Street and it stopped there, and that's how you stepped up to get into the stagecoach. Now, we still have some hitching posts in town.
They do.
There's one in on Rushbrook Street, and there's one by Earl's
Madison.
house. And there was another one that was in front of the post office that got knocked over by a car. They were built in the 1800s for horses.
Art has the 2-step down across from German Cemetery.
I see there's 2 steps there. Are they the ones from Collins, or are they original ones from down there? I think they're from down in the powder mills.
I got them from the column.
You got them from Collins. So those steps are still in German then?
Yeah.
There's a set of steps down where Art has the building from the powder mills. He bought the building on the corner, which was the office for the powder mills. The Music powder mills was here in 1854, and it made the dynamite and all the blasting stuff for the mines. It exploded about 7 times. People were killed in it numerous times. There was an explosion one time in the powder mills that they heard in Montrose.
Wow. Wow.
Montrose is how
Wow.
far away?
Oh, wow.
They heard it and felt it in Montrose.
Wow.
Now we have pictures of the dam. They built a dam there by the powder mills as well because they needed water power and they had a water wheel. So there was a dam. If you go down from Art Wilson's house and you go straight down over the river, there was a dam across the river there. We have pictures of that in there. And there was a whole bunch of buildings in the powder mills. In fact, they were just torn down, some of them, in the 1980s maybe. Some of the last ones, but there was some.
There's still a foundation.
There's still a couple
In
foundations.
the cemetery.
Yeah, in the cemetery was part of it, because that cemetery was part of it. And before I forget the cemetery, 1868, we had a cemetery in German called the Shady Side Cemetery. And if you go up Gibson Street and you go up to the projects, to the right-hand side where the new development is, that was the Shady Side Cemetery. And to the left-hand side of the road was the town dump. Now, there were a couple town dumps. There was one to the left of Gibson Street. There was one, if you look at the new development that's built behind the Little League field, the last house in that development, there was a dump behind that. And then there was a dump on Main Street, right by the Lackawanna River, right behind where Freese's building was. There used to be a little park there back in the day, and there was a dump behind there. So there were 3 town dumps. There were 2 cemeteries, and Shady Sites Cemetery was moved by the coal company because they wanted to mine where the graves were. They wanted to mine underneath it, so they paid the cemetery, and they paid to move every grave.
Yes.
So when that happened, they gave us a piece of land where the powder mill was. The powder mill gave it to the borough to move bodies there. And the coal company purchased the Valley View Cemetery, which is up in Montvale. And most of the people moved up to Valley View Cemetery. So we had cemeteries, churches. 1874 was the Episcopal, 1870 was here, 1884 was the Congregational, 1892 was the Primitive Methodist, 1894 or 5 was the Catholic, and 1909 was the Russian, and 1890s was the Baptist Church.
I'm gonna add to the cemetery, when all those people and bodies were taken up, families were divided. Some went to
Oh, that's right.
German,
Yeah, that's
some went
it.
to Valley View.
Yeah.
And after all that was cleared out of the bodies, they found very little coal.
Oh, really?
They didn't dig for coal.
Well,
They didn't even dig for coal. After they paid to move all that, they never dug.
Really?
Never dug. They paid to move all that and never dug. They strip mined it.
yeah,
But
well, they,
that was later on in the later on in the 1950s and 60s. They strip mined it.
yeah,
But back when they were moving those bodies, they never went there and mined it underneath.
Digging up a body and moving it, and digging a new grave, they got paid $15.
$15? Well, they didn't get paid as much as the teachers.
What year was the cemetery moved? My mother always spoke of it. What year was it moved?
What year was it moved?
Yeah, from,
That's in one of my books.
because we have the split, like you said, there's some in Valley View and some here, and
I believe it was 1930s.
1930s?
yeah.
I believe it was the 1930s when they
It's
moved it.
down
'Cause,
on the stone, I think 30, 32.
Okay, my
Yeah.
mother often spoke of it.
one of the things that up in the Valley View Cemetery is a big white rock, great big boulder, and that was in German, and they moved it up there when they opened that cemetery. That was in some place where they used to swim in German, whether it was in the Lackawanna River,
It was in the creek.
it was in the
You
Russian,
go up past the bridge.
up at,
Giant rock.
great big white rock. It was up in the Rushbrook Creek. Up, that's right. I remember it now. It was up in the Rushbrook Creek, and they used to. It was like they dammed it up along by that rock, and they would swim in
My
it.
mother often
And
spoke
then
of
they
that.
wanted to move that rock, so they dug that rock up, and they took it up, and that great big rock is up in Valley View Cemetery. Came out.
That's from in there?
So, any other questions? Anything else you would like to learn about that I didn't touch on because there's so
What was
much?
the jail? Like, if anybody got in trouble, did they have a local jail down here?
German had a jail underneath the community house.
But in
Yeah,
1800,
it's still there. There was like 3 cells, maybe 4 cells. If you went into the basement of the old community house, there was a jail there. I remember playing there when I was a kid with the Boy Scouts. So we did have a jail.
does everybody know, you refer to the Collins Building? In current day, Collins Building is located where?
Right, right across from Debbie's Flower Shop on Main Street. So if you were standing looking at Debbie's Flower Shop on the left-hand side of Franklin Street, Collins Building would be on the right-hand side. It's an apartment building. It's now an apartment building, but that was Grace Collins's soda fountain.
That's when I went.
When we were
kids. I remember.
And it was 3 stories tall, and that was the Avery Hotel back in the day.
There, I did. Karen put it in the night.
Any other questions? Anything about breakers or coal or trains or? Anything else anybody would
Did a
like to
very
know
good
about?
job, thank you.
Very good, yes.
I don't know how everyone else feels, but you went up to the 1800s. Sometime in the future, maybe go a little beyond that.
Well, there's a lot of history in German from 1900 to 1950 or 60. And a lot of that will encompass some of the sports teams, some of the schools, some of the businesses that came here later. German was it was in the paper, it was listed as the most prominent town in Lackawanna County. It had more businesses than any other town. Oliphant was bigger, Archibald was bigger, Dixon City was bigger, but German had more businesses per capita than any other town in the valley.
Compared to Carbondale?
When it had, no, that was a city.
Oh, that's the, oh, I see.
City. But
Thank
of
you.
the towns
I
that
see,
were in
town,
Lackawanna
okay.
County, German had the most businesses
Oh, I
per
see.
capita.
Okay.
There had to be hundreds and hundreds of businesses in German at that time in the 1800s. All kinds of, like I said, I mentioned 5 or 6 meat markets, 5 or 6 barber shops, 5 or 6 bakeries. There had to be 5 to 7 general stores, hat stores, shoe stores, tailor shops, shoemakers, cobblers,
shoemaking.
restaurants, hotels, bars. There was bars, I can name bars forever.
And your aunt, Margaret Smallcombe Jewels, said there was a dress factory by Langland's Market and Rushmore.
Oh, yeah.
Not dress factory.
A dress shop.
Dress shop.
Yeah.
And they went to New York City
Yes,
Yeah.
and would buy the
It brought-
dresses and bring them in.
yeah.
Yeah, Edith Langman ran that
I
when I
ran
was
it,
a
yeah.
kid.
I bought dresses
Yeah,
there.
Langman, I was Langman's dress shop. Another thing I didn't touch on was the newspapers in German. We had the German press,
I didn't know that.
which was also called the Press, and there was also called the Republican Advocate, I believe, and something. There was 4 different newspapers. Started in the 1800s.
Really?
We had 4 newspapers. Thomas Boundy. Thomas Boundy was the editor of the German press at one time. Thomas Boundy wrote a book of poems, and it's still very famous and hard. You can't get an original copy. I tried to buy them and I can't find them. I forget the name of it, like something Liberty. But if you look up the name Thomas Boundy in the internet, you'll find out how he was very famous. And in the 1800s, he went to Alaska to mine gold with Dawson Langman's father, and it was about one of the East Lakes. His great-grandfather went. There's a book on that as well. We have a book on that tells you all about the people that went to, they went up to Alaska to find gold, and none of them came back rich, but some of them made some money and found some money. But that was in the 1800s as well, when they went to Alaska. Pardon? One of them was killed. Somebody from German was killed up there, and the rest of them all came back. Nobody really came back rich, but Thomas Boundy was very famous. He was one of them that went. Like I said, Langman went, Eastlake went. It's in one of our books, and I don't know if it's this one. Let's see. That's all about miners. I had one that had something in there about.
When did Miller's 5 and Dime come with 1900? Huh?
1940s.
Oh, 1940. They were on 1940s.
Oh, this is for the council people from Mayfield. This is for them. Ordinances of the Borough of German. Okay. This is approved. An ordinance to prevent the racing of horses in the Borough of Gibsonburg. Section 1, that on and after September 20th, 1870, no horse racing shall be allowed upon any streets of the Borough of Gibsonburg. If any horse, mare, or gelding shall be willfully made or caused to be made to run or perform a race upon the public streets of the borough, the owner shall, upon conviction, be liable to a fine of $5. It's got to be still on the books. It's got to be. Here's another one. To prevent the running of large swine in the borough of Gibsonburg. Be it enacted by the town council of the borough of Gibsonburg that it shall be unlawful for any swine to run at large within the limits of the borough of Gibsonburg on or after the 10th day of July next. But it shall, if any such shall be found at large in the borough, such swine, hogs, shoats, or pigs shall be driven by an inhabitant of said borough to a pound provided for that purpose, which shall be kept by the High Constable. The High Constable shall have the power to collect a sum of $1 per head. And that was in 1870 as well. Let's see what this one says. Okay. To any person, any and every person or persons owning or having in their possession any mule or mules, horse or horses, colt or colts, and permitting them to run at large within the borough of the said borough, at any all time shall be liable to a fine not less than $2 or more than $5. 1875. James Dunn was the burgess at that time. C.D. Winter, who owned the store, was the clerk. You had to keep up your sidewalks even back then. It was unlawful to keep your sidewalk in need of repair. There was one about racing pigs too. I don't know if I can find that, but it was unlawful to race pigs in the borough.
Race pigs.
All right, this one here, this is an interesting one. Any person who shall be found intoxicated in the borough of German, so we're newer now, we're in 1874, who shall be guilty of any indecent exposure of his or her person, or who shall make use of any vulgar or obscene language, or shall make use of any loud, boisterous, or insulting language, tending to excite a breach of the peace, or who shall be guilty of any other disorderly conduct in the borough of German, shall, upon conviction thereof, pay a fine of not less than $1 nor more than $25 and costs, or undergo imprisonment in the borough lockup, not exceeding 48 hours. And if you were found wandering or loitering in the streets of German, let's see, how much is that one? You would go into the borough lockup not to exceed 48 hours, and they can't find you because you don't have any money anyway. Let's see, this ordinance here. This is an ordinance to lease the Crystal Fire Company. That's nothing special. The Carbondale Traction Company to lay tracks and operate a street railway on certain streets in the borough of German, being ordained. The Burgess Town Council of Borough of German is ordained by authority that the Carbondale Traction Company be authorized to lay tracks and operate a passenger street railway. That was our streetcar line that went up Main Street. That was back in 1870. They don't even have the year on there, do they? That was 1892. George Pendard was the Burgess at that time. Let's see, be it ordained to Borough Council. Okay. The weather, let's see. Whatever is dangerous to human life or health, whatever renders the air or food or water to drink unwholesome, and whatever building, erection, or part of or cellar thereof is overcrowded, or not provided with an adequate means of ingress and egress, or not well ventilated, sewered, drained, cleaned, or lighted, are declared to be a nuisance and to be illegal, and every person having aided in creating or contributing to the same will be in violation. So that's some of the ordinances back in the day.
Well, thank you. Very good. We enjoyed it. What time is it? Not here? I'm sorry.
I have, that is in the powder company. It's in that book on the powder. Let me look it up real quick.
I want to look at those books. Want to see those books?
We're done. So,
Okay.
if anybody has any questions,
Yeah, you did a very good job. Very good job.
would you like me to explain anything, I will. This photo is of the coal mine locally that Walter had.
It was something, wasn't it?
I don't know, anything, anybody has any questions
I'd
on
like to look
anything?
one of those books. And no Thayer, and you don't remember Thayer? Hardwick? You don't remember the name?
No, no.
Here?
I